Hello and welcome to another Outlook discussion on the cover story. We have Outlook editor Chinky Sinha joining us all the way from California. The cover story this
Hmm.
time is, as I choose, the print edition is actually already on the stands, and many people might have seen it on online. But we would like to discuss it. It's about the politics of translations. What gets translated, what gets left out, who gets translated, who does not, which region, literature and poetry coming from which region gets to be translated in other language, and some of the marginalized and way out regions do not. So these are the issues that we have tackled in this edition. In fact, the magazine begins with a very fascinating piece by Chinky herself about growing up in Ara in Bihar, and gorging on translated books from Russia, from Germany. Chinky, if you'd like to talk a little bit about that, how Gorky and Pushkin more than any of our Indian authors.
No, because I think it was that time, there's a whole 70s, 80s, and 90s where children like grew up on Russian literature in small town. And that was because of the Cold War, and there's a huge politics thing behind it, like how Russian, the India and Russia had these ties, and the
Yeah,
Russian publishing houses like Raduga and, Mir and People's Press, they were all there. And, used to get like 10 rupees may, it was a
right.
very
It
nicely
used to be so cheap.
designed,
Yeah,
and these like very cheap.
yes.
And there used to be these book fairs, of all of this is nostalgia now, but we used to get all this. And my grandfather, he was a literature guy, and he had this huge library, and he had all kinds of books. He actually used to get the Russian from books from Russia actually. So I grew up reading. I mean, it was very boring in Ara. We had long power cuts. What do you do? I mean, we hated going there, but so I got introduced to these books. And I still remember I read Alberto Moravia, Italian author. And the only person actually I found in India who read him was Vinay Pathak, that actor. And
Yeah,
he got that book as a prize in his school, which was Bishop Scott in Jharkhand. It's quite fascinating. And there was this book, which I still remember for many years. I've remembered it. It's The Conformist, where the main character actually kills lizards, and he grows up to be a fascist later. And it's quite a fascinating thing. And my cousin used to kill lizards. In those days there were these vacuum, the Eureka Forbes vacuum machine. They used to suck these lizards in that paper bag, all kinds of cruelty things. And
hmm,
so that's how you grew up. And I knew about Baba Yaga, the witch. And actually, if you ask me about Indian folk tales, I don't know many. I mean, I did
right,
read Amar Chitrakatha, and Chanda Mama used to be there at that time.
right.
And Chanda Mama I read. I mean, I'm bilingual. But the whole point was it that, you started to imagine, things like mink coats and,
Yeah,
Siberian winters and this like
right.
snow and all that. Here we don't have that kind of weather. So in effect, we all became translated beings. Everything came through translation in that small town. It was pre-liberalization, that time. And after that also, I mean, it didn't percolate that much to small town India in that sense. It was in the 90s, early 90s and stuff.
Yeah, so that's
Yeah,
what
go
I,
ahead.
of course, now, Geetanjali Shree's book, Raid Samadhi, has won this international booker, and, it's all the rage suddenly. But we are also looking at how we still, need validation from the West in some ways,
Yeah.
for a great Hindi novel to be, recognized even within the country. So there is that, I mean, there is that question.
Yeah, that is the question. And also, see, if you look at it, I mean, I grew up also reading a lot of Premchand, for instance, and I always believed later that Premchand should be a model for journalism. The way he tackled the social issues of those times. And we used to have these fascinating. I mean, I did ICSC, and we still had those books. Like Poos Ki Raat.
Yeah,
That I still remember those characters, like that Eidgah story where this. It was very. I don't know. I mean, you got empathy. You had this empathy for the characters. Later on, of course,
yeah,
Namdev Dhasal. If it weren't for the translation, I would have never been able to read Dhasal, for instance, because he's a Marathi guy. And for all my research in Kamatipura, actually, it's all started with that poem by him called Golpita, and this Kamatipura and all these things. So I think we don't need that validation, of course not, because Hindi literature always has been not just Hindi, actually, Tamil, Telugu, everything.
yeah.
And I think at Outlook we recognized that early on, in that sense that we started to do a lot of translations ourselves. We
Yes.
start, like from the hinterland, the reportage, we started to kind of get those people to write, because we
Right.
thought the voice belongs to them. And I've always had this thing about the English publishing houses, in that sense. And not a lot of interesting or good stuff is coming out in terms of, like, capturing the social, political, and our context, the caste context or this context. That it's all very superficial in that sense. Whereas we have, like, very, very powerful guys like Damodar Mauzo, who's writing from Goa, or you have Perumal Murugan, you have all kinds of people now.
Yeah.
And even,
And-
like, if you go much beyond, you have, like, these very,
Yes.
very unknown kind of people who are writing great stuff. And I think
Yeah.
the world needs to know that. And
Right.
more than the world, I think we need to know our own things.
And yes, I mean, as you said, we have tried our best to, do this. Like, for instance, soon after the pandemic, we did an issue where Perumal Murugan really wrote a original story for us, which in Tamil, and which we got translated. And during the UP elections, for instance, so many of the reports that came from the local journalists in Hindi, and which we got translated into English and published, had so much more, sort of value and so much more insights about them.
Yeah.
So those things that we are trying to do. And you're right, while growing up, I mean, I think one knew more of Shakespeare and William Wordsworth rather than, a Tagore or a, Thiruvalluvar or any of the,
Yeah.
It's just that what is taught, because that is another sort of, another argument altogether. But even what is translated is so much of, great Tamil literature and poetry, for instance, Malayalam, from the south, from Bengal. Bengal maybe has a lot more than other regions, but even then, it's just the tip of the iceberg. There is such a lot that is
a lot
there
of literature
we
out
don't
there,
know.
poetry, beautiful.
Yes.
Also, I think it's very important in today's world, where you have a lot of this othering and polarization and these identity questions, which are kind of like leading to violence. And this whole understanding of the other also comes from literature, because literature is a reflection of our times in a way, right? Like fiction, poetry, all of these things. And at Outlook, we do recognize that, and we kind of say that, okay, that is also part of journalism, like this whole chronicling of things, even in fiction or poetry. I think poetry is quite in terms of evidence, I think it serves that purpose rather well, in terms of compression, in terms of, like, we have
Absolutely.
been doing those issues like hip hop, and we did that other issue on syllabus a few months ago, where actually Mahashweta Devi's Draupadi was dropped from the syllabus, and that also is translated now. And Draupadi, it's about that social thing, it's about that a woman, it's about the tribal rights and all of these politics. So if you don't understand the politics, from there, how are you going to understand people, or how are you going to keep them together, especially in today's world where there's a lot of this hate stuff going on? I think literature, writing, poetry, everything. I think there's a need for that.
In fact, Urvashi Bhutalia, publisher of the feminist publishing house Zuban, touches upon this a little bit in our article. That is an excellent article that is written for us. How for a small publication like hers, it's so difficult really, to translate and to be commercially viable. To pitch the right, and she tries her best, but she's talked about the challenges there. And then we have, of course, S. Anand of Navaina, who's written a great article on piece on the translation, how poetry never gets translated that much.
Never. I mean, poetry doesn't even get published that for that matter.
Correct.
I mean, translation, to forget it.
Yes. Whereas Anand actually argues that India as a whole, I mean, we probably our poetry is far better than our prose in many ways. In terms of creativity, in terms of the political message, etc.
A lot more political, I think, and it's very visual, because I think our visuals are very stark in that sense. I mean, I'm sure everybody else's is also, but in a way that you see, like Namdev Dasa's poetry, you actually can smell Kamatipura. The other thing I wanted to ask, I talk about was Gulzar, and that article came from this one conversation where there was this book that he had written, prose, his first prose thing. And he talked about the challenges of translating that book. And he had given it to somebody to translate. And he wasn't very happy in that sense, that he thought, and he had spoken to me at that time about the challenges of his own book. And he got to translating it. And then he said that, how do you, like Shalwar ko, how do you translate that? And these are small things. And the other debate that has always been there, and I think it started from this Orhan Pamuk time, or before that actually also, how translators never get the credit. And there's this whole movement about putting their names on the cover of the book, on the book
Yeah.
jacket. And I think it happened with Olga. I really can't spell her last name, but pronounce her, but Tuzarchuk, who got
Yeah.
the Nobel and the International Booker, I think, in 2018 for her book called Flights. And her, I think Jennifer, she basically asked the publisher to give her credit on the, and then Olga said yes, you need to give the credit because she also won the Nobel Prize. And
Yes.
and it's very important because a lot of these writers actually are very, very important figures in their own countries or are
Absolutely.
doing very important stuff, but the world
Yeah.
never gets to know. I mean, for me to understand Poland or Russia or for any Ukraine, for instance, I think it comes from literature. That's our first window.
So incredible. I mean, it's hard to believe that actually say all of Gabriel Marquez, all of Camus,
Yeah.
all of Kafka, all of Murakami, all of we have Dostoevsky,
Yeah.
Tolstoy, Pushkin. We have only read in translation. I mean, it's like
Totally. I
Neruda.
think we are all
Yeah,
translated beings, in
we
that
are all
sense. And I think
yes,
that credited because translation is a political act, I mean,
yes,
and Gayatri Spivak Chakrabarti, who has talked a lot about this whole politics of translation, does talk about it. And she touches upon that whole thing, can the subaltern speak? And this is a way for letting the subaltern speak and reaching a wider audience. You don't need us to write about them. They can write about themselves, and translation then becomes a bridge. And of course, translation is a very creative process as well. As it can't always be literal translation. It also has to
yeah.
have contextual translation.
And extending
So
this,
that
in our back of the book, the substrata section, we also have Mithu Sen, who's amazing images, as well as the poetry, by Tarun Bhartiya.
Tarun Bhartiya, he, that's quite interesting. And Mithu's whole thing about gibberish, because that's the language.
Yeah.
And I think I read it somewhere that, translation begins actually from, there's this poem when a mother starts to understand what the child wants. And that's the first step.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's the first translation,
when
the child's needs, cries. Yeah. And the mother is the first translator. And I think that's a beautiful thing, how, I mean, you can't go to many places. You can never go to many, you have a finite life and finite resources or whatever, but you can imagine those places, and that's where translations are very important to, in the whole digital world, I think, where you can click and see, our imagination never gets this thing. I think that's what literature does. Yeah.
As always, there is a lot to read in this edition, a lot of interesting, insightful pieces. And we just said poetry, there's the painting, there's work, and it's visually very rich. So please do pick up a copy or go on.
And we have a lot of stuff online as well.
Online, please do log on to our website, www.outlookindia.com. A lot of, we are trying to package this, since the magazine is finite and, we can only have so many photos or artwork there, but in the online, we are able to put out even more. So we are trying to package those and also show you, what we have, what we have left out in the magazine. So please do log on and pick up the magazine.